Let's get some political reaction to this story. Chris Alexander is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. Matthew Kellway is the NDP's Deputy Critic on the military procurement. And John McKay is the Liberal Defence Critic. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Chris Alexander, let me just go over this, what we've seen on this statement of requirements. First of all, right now, would the F-35 fail to meet the mandatory requirement that your own government wrote for this plane?
The F-35 has met the requirements, has exceeded all the other candidates to fulfill this role by a wide margin in meeting the requirements, and that's why it's been selected.
But Mr. Alexander, I'm trying to be specific. There is a specific mandatory requirement in the Statement of Requirements, as written on June 1st, 2010, that said it must have a 360-degree capability in a no-light environment. According to the Department of Defense in the U.S. and according to the United States Government Accountability Office, deficiencies with the helmet-mounted display integral to mission systems functionality and concepts are problematic, and DoD is funding a less capable alternate helmet. In other words, they don't have the thing ready.
Evan, it's a developmental project, as we've said on your program many times. As for the Statement of Requirements, I'm not going to comment on a document I don't have in front of me in this interview. It's not unusual for items that are being procured for the Canadian Forces not to meet every one of the developmental requirements. It's a question of relative choices. You take the one that meets most of them, and in this case, a very large number of requirements were met, and you leave the ones behind that don't.
But Mr. Alexander, I have to challenge you on that, because there's 3 tiers here. Tier A is a mandatory requirement. In the Statement of Requirements, it says the product must meet mandatory requirements for consideration, otherwise it is high risk. If it's not mandatory, then it's dropped down to what's called a Tier 1 or even Tier 2 requirement. This was a mandatory requirement. So the truth is, it's not optional. If it can't meet it, it's high risk, and therefore shouldn't be selected.
Well, I don't think you're a better judge of that than the Canadian Forces are, and they looked at this very rigorously.
The Canadian Forces
has met these requirements, and I also don't know what your previous guest was saying, because on the one hand, he was saying there were too many requirements, and that excluded other aircraft from consideration. On the other hand, you're saying it meets too few. So we're going in different directions here. The bottom line is this aircraft has been selected by 9 countries, including many of our closest allies. It is a stealth aircraft, the only one that was available to Canada in that category that met those requirements, which are going to be very important in the future if we want our pilots to come back alive. And it's the one that the Canadian Forces looked at very carefully over not just 10 years, 15 years. And to suggest that we haven't influenced the process by being part of it is ludicrous.
Okay, Mr. Alexander, there's a couple things here. 2 things I have to challenge you on. First of all, what Mr. Williams said, there's 28 mandatory requirements in the Statement of Requirements. Most other planes, according to the DoD, even in the U.S., can meet 26 of them. The 2 that specifically the F-35 is supposed to meet, 2 of those, one of them is the 360-degree, this helmet, which gives a pilot full rotation. Apparently, it cannot meet this according to the Department of Defense. That's a mandatory requirement. The second one you talk about is stealth, and there's, yes, frankly, in the document, there's a lot of questions about that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, you say it's 15 years to talk about it, but the Statement of Requirement was only written specifically to outline what it needs in June of 2010. A month and a half before Peter MacKay comes out. What happened in that month and a half? There's supposed to be a process, according to the Auditor General.
There have been many documents relating to this acquisition. Some under the Liberal government. That's what got us started back in the late 90s and the early part of the last decade, as your guest was discussing. And then others since 2006 under our government. The one you referred to is one of them, a very important one. But there are plenty of others. And in fact, our Defense Committee is going to be, has called this evidence, and we'll be looking at it at some appropriate point in the not too distant future. Okay. So there's a detailed paper trail here. But this is the best aircraft to defend our Arctic, to meet our international obligations, to be interoperable with our allies, European, U.S., UK, and others, and to make sure that our pilots do the job at the very highest level, which is what we expect of them, and come back home safely.
I want to bring in the opposition, but last thing, I remind you that in last fall, the Auditor General, previous Auditor General Sheila Fraser, talked about the Chinook helicopters, and she said that there was lots of problems with it, the procurement, because the process was not carefully followed, costing the Canadian taxpayer billions of dollars, and she warned that the F-35 is high risk. It seems like the exact same sole source, the process not being followed, even according to the procurement expert like Alan Williams, it wasn't followed. Was the proper process followed for the F-35?
Well, the Chinooks are the right aircraft for that purpose. We wouldn't have had to reacquire them if the Liberals hadn't sold them in the 90s. Sheila Fraser made some important, pertinent comments with regard to that acquisition. We're going to take those on board, but we were reacquiring it to serve our troops in Afghanistan under time pressure to save lives. And I found your previous guest's comments that it wasn't the right aircraft, or that we should have waited 2 or 3 more years to go through some strenuous re-evaluation of something Canada had already owned, offensive, because that aircraft saved lives. And when you're in operations, when your troops are in combat, having the right equipment is even more important. With the F-35, we've had many years to come to the conclusions we've come to. We haven't signed a contract. That's still in the future. But we're confident as of today that this is the right aircraft for our Royal Canadian Air Force and for 8 other allies.
All right. Let me get Matthew Kellway, John McCain. I had a long time there with Chris Alexander. What's your view? What is this statement of requirements, the June 1st, 2010 one that we're seeing here, and the mandatory requirements? What does it tell you, Mr. Kellway?
Well, of course, Evan, we haven't seen that document. We're anticipating seeing it later this week in camera and probably highly redacted at the Defense Committee. But picking up on what I'm hearing you talk about the document, what it says to me is that this file has been so badly bungled by Ministers Fantino and McKay that they couldn't even rig the competition competently. It says to me as well that the F-35 has always been an idea and remains an idea, but a fundamentally flawed and extremely expensive idea. When you look at the U.S.'s Government Accountability Office testimony to the House of Representatives Subcommittee last week, they described the logistics and mission systems of the plane, which the things that make it a jet fighter, as unproven and immature and only 4% complete. And the last point I would make, and of course we've heard about the helmet and the need to redesign of a helmet. The last point I would make, and I'm in agreement with your guest Alan Williams about this one, is that it shows once again the value of having an open, transparent tendering process where you can be sure that you're getting the best product available, you're getting the best price, and you're maximizing the industrial benefits for Canada. And finally, what the important part about the tendering process is that you ensure that the government is transparent about the statement of requirements with all Canadians and the mission that this government intends to use this plane for. They talk in the House about mission success all the time, Minister Fantino does, but they have never ever defined for us what the mission is that this plane is intended for.
Lockheed Martin, let me get John McKay. Lockheed Martin, when we asked them today, will Canada's statement of requirements be met by the time Canada acquires the planes? They said the mandatory requirements will be met, but of course it doesn't necessarily mean they're being met right now, which according to this document they're supposed to be. What's your reaction to this document and Alan Williams' characterization of it?
Well, at one level, it's nothing new. Alan Williams has been saying this for months, if not years. You and I will recall the last Parliament. This was a live issue, and for Alan Williams' troubles, he was ridiculed from here to Victoria and back. He knows the process. He knows that there is a persistent failure to understate the costs and understate the complexity of these programs, both the Chinook and the F-35s. He knows that this is an inherently uncompetitive industry in which there is virtually no competition, no openness, no transparency, and it's bewildering why the government stays with its line. I thought actually Minister Fantino last week actually showed a glimmer of insight that this thing is actually derailing, but Chris and Minister McKay seem to be pursuing or staying with the standard line. So I think that Williams is actually onto something here, and I think it needs to be followed.
Mr. Alexander, I got about 30 seconds left. If this statement of requirements, written again, June 1st, 2010, if the plane cannot meet some of its mandatory requirements, is that perhaps why Minister Fantino and the ministry is now perhaps backing away from possibly buying this plane?
We are not backing away from anything at this point. Everyone, all 9 partners under this memorandum of understanding will be striving to make sure the aircraft meets everyone's requirements. And Canada will be fighting very hard to make sure it meets our requirements. We're on track to achieve that. And my only invitation to you, Evan, would be, you've had my 2 opposition colleagues on repeatedly dumping on the program. They seem to not want an aircraft of this caliber for Canada. You had Alan Williams on, who's a well-known outlier on this issue. Have one of the hundreds of Canadian pilots or other experts in this country who are of one view that this is the right aircraft for Canada.
But Mr. Alexander, the reason we're having them is because we've obtained a document called the Statement of Requirements, and it appears that the plane's incapable of fulfilling one of its own mandatory requirements, and it also appears that it was written a month and a half before. All right, we're trying to follow the documents. I'm not an expert on the plane. I'm just trying to make sense of the process.
Fighter pilots are pretty good experts.
Well, the fighter pilots don't make the determination to purchase, as you and I both know the bureaucracy does.
They have to use them, and they're actually a good source of expertise.
We talk to them all the time. Chris Alexander, Matthew Kellway, and John McKay, I appreciate your time on this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.
Thanks.